Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. My wife's ex-husband lives in Millridge, a small town nestled in the Adirondack Mountains. One night at around 1 a.m., he called her in a panic. Their daughter, Ellie, had experienced a severe mental health crisis, something too personal to describe in detail. But she was hospitalized. This happened during the height of the pandemic, when everyone was already struggling. My wife loves Ellie as her own, having lived with her for 10 years. So she asked if I would drive with her to see what we could do to help. We left Albany around 1:30 a.m. I hate driving at this hour, but in emergencies, you do what needs to be done. The stretch of Route 17 leading to Millridge was emptier than I'd ever seen it. Even at night, there's usually some traffic, but this time not a soul. Maybe the thunderstorm had convinced people to stay home. That suited me fine. I drove at a moderate speed due to the downpour, and because I'd been asleep just minutes earlier. Even the strong black coffee I'd brought along couldn't fully wake me. And then out of nowhere, right through the heavy sheets of rain, we clearly saw something dart in front of us, racing diagonally across the highway at an impossible speed. It was a child, a little girl. I jerked the wheel sharply, nearly careening off the road. We immediately pulled over, turned on the hazard lights, and rushed out to search for her. My wife and I. But nothing, no trace of the girl or any other living being. There wasn't even a place where she could have run from or disappeared to. It was like a vision, an apparition that appeared for a moment and vanished just as quickly. We called the state police, but they didn't give it much importance. After 30 minutes of searching, we had to give up and continue our journey. We were expected at the hospital, and every minute counted. The following days in Millridge were difficult, filled with grief and emotional exhaustion. I think that's why we somehow pushed that night's incident to the back of our minds. But a few weeks later, I remembered it again. I wanted to find that spot, the exact point where it all happened. I opened Google Maps to figure out where the girl might have come from. But I stumbled upon something worse. The first thing that caught my eye was a news story about that area. Just 6 months earlier, there had been a school bus accident there. Several children didn't make it. Now I don't know what we saw that night. Was it a lost soul still wandering this world? Or just a ghost, merely an echo of that terrible moment? And sometimes, when I close my eyes at night, I can still see her, running through the rain, her pale face turned toward our headlights for just a fraction of a second. What haunts me most isn't the apparition itself. It's the question of whether she was running toward us, or trying to warn us away. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. I want to share a story that, until now, only those who lived through it have known. Some members of my family and my closest friend. It was she who convinced me to share it here. This story is about people who work on the road, like all the men on my father's side of the family. They're similar to men of past generations, not in their attitude toward women, thank God, but in the way they never open up. They don't share what happens to them, especially if it's something that evokes fear. We gradually learned about the things that happened to them on the highways, things we couldn't even imagine. But they treated it as ordinary. They didn't need to understand what was happening, because it's not about believing in the supernatural, but about the fact that when you spend half your life on the road, certain things eventually catch up with you, even if you don't want to know about them. My Uncle Ray has been driving long-haul trucks across the Midwest for over 20 years. He's seen it all. People appearing on roadsides in places and at hours where they shouldn't be. Figures crossing the road in the middle of the night where there wasn't a trace of human habitation. He's seen balls of fire in the sky, what people call highway witches, that sometimes appeared in the distance over the plains of Kansas, and sometimes followed his truck, floating parallel along the empty fields. But he never paid attention. He said it was better not to give meaning to such things. That when you spend so much time behind the wheel, your eyes sometimes see things that aren't there, and your brain just fills in the gaps with what it already knows. He said if you thought about it carefully, everything could be explained. But he didn't like to think about it. He's not someone who scares easily. He's serious, quiet, always calm no matter what happens. That's why when he told this story, and did so during a funeral, nobody doubted that what he saw was real. It happened on a quiet autumn night when he was almost at the truck stop outside Lincoln, Nebraska. The cab of his semi was silent, except for the low country station playing softly. The engine hummed steadily after a recent tune-up, and the interstate was clear. It was even a bit strange, as he had left Chicago in the middle of a thunderstorm. But everything indicated the journey would end without any obstacles. He was already imagining eating a stack of pancakes for breakfast, when suddenly he saw a man. An old man. He was walking along the side of the highway, slowly hunched over, with a distant, confused gaze. At that hour, there shouldn't have been anyone there. There were no exits, no rest areas, no broken-down vehicles, nothing that would explain his presence. Uncle Ray slowed down and stopped a few yards ahead. As the truck pulled alongside, he rolled down his window. "Sir, are you all right?" The old man raised his head, and his face was filled with confusion. "Who are you?" he hissed in a raspy voice. The response threw my uncle off balance. He thought the man might be lost or involved in some accident and couldn't remember what had happened. "I'm a trucker, sir, heading to the Lincoln truck stop. Need a ride? Do you need help?" The old man shook his head no, but his gaze remained absent, as if he was struggling to remember something important. Finally, he raised his eyes and said the thing that chilled my uncle to the bone. "Drive carefully, son. Death is very close." And then he just walked away. His figure grew more distant on the road, heading in the opposite direction. Uncle Ray watched him for a few seconds in the mirror, unable to shake a strange feeling. Something in the voice, something in the way this man walked reminded him of his grandfather. His manner of speaking, stern advice disguised as guidance. But most of all, his eyes. Perhaps it was someone who had spent his entire life on the road, and learned to see what others couldn't. My uncle sighed and drove on, but he hadn't gone more than half a mile when something made him slam on the brakes. Right in the middle of the road stood a horse. It was breathing heavily. Its coat was wet. It seemed as if it was covered in blood. Uncle Ray got out, approached cautiously, and saw tiny cuts on its legs, scratches, as if it had escaped from a tight space or something had pinned it down. And when he looked up, everything became clear. A few yards from the road, in a shallow ravine, lay an overturned pickup truck with a horse trailer attached. He moved closer. It was a horrific sight. The vehicle was completely crushed. Nobody could have survived such a wreck. My uncle looked at the horse again. How did it survive if it came from there? Nothing made sense. Uncle Ray turned on his hazard lights and waited for the police to arrive. And the whole time, he couldn't stop thinking about the old man, about his words. What did he mean by warning about death? How did he appear just before the accident? Was he a spirit, a harbinger, or maybe the soul of the driver himself, not yet aware that he was already on the other side? Or was he running from death's dark shadow that followed in his footsteps? 5 years passed, and my other uncle, Mike, who also drove trucks, experienced something similar. One night on Route 66, heading toward Amarillo, he saw a man. An old man, hunched over with a confused look, walking slowly. They stopped and opened the door. "Sir, can I help you?" The old man raised his head and whispered hoarsely, "Death is very close." Then he added, "I'm coming for Virginia," and vanished into the darkness. 3 days later, while watching the local news in a diner, my Uncle Mike learned that Virginia Holloway, the owner of a small roadside motel just outside Amarillo, had passed away that night, at almost the exact time he'd encountered the old man on the highway. The motel had been in her family for generations, and locals called her the mother of the road, because she'd help any traveler in need, often letting truckers stay for free when they were down on their luck. Uncle Mike had stayed at her motel many times over the years. She'd always said the same thing when he left: "The road is long, but I'll be waiting when you come back through." He never told her about his encounter with the old man. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. But sometimes, late at night when the interstate stretches empty before him, he swears he can see Virginia's motel sign glowing in the distance, even when he knows it's been closed for years now. And sometimes, just sometimes, he thinks he sees an old man walking slowly along the shoulder of the road, hunched over, as if carrying the weight of all the travelers who never made it home. I'm a photographer based in Seattle, but whenever I get the chance, I drive down to Arizona to capture its unique landscapes that you can't find anywhere else. My grandparents died when I was just a teenager, and every journey to their homeland, to my heritage, allows me to feel connected to them, to be closer to their memory. This story happened during one of those trips, when I decided to cross the entire stretch of the Sonoran Desert by car, making stops for photography along the way. I always drive slowly, carefully taking in the surroundings, and planned my route so I'd only travel a few hours each day, always in daylight. The main goal was to have enough time to stop and explore the terrain. Those who have made a similar journey, or at least looked at a map, know From Ajo, the last small town in western Arizona, it's about 5 to 6 hours of desert driving to reach Gila Bend. Desert, nothing but desert. Although I left early in the morning, the landscapes were so captivating that the day flew by. Those 6 hours weren't enough. I stopped too often to take photos. But when I finally decided to drive straight to my next destination without any more stops, I was suddenly overcome by intense nausea. It seemed that something I'd eaten the day before, and it was only a roadside diner burger, wasn't sitting right with me. Somewhere near a place called Crater Valley, I decided to pull over. I spotted what looked like an old gas station or small store in the middle of nowhere, and decided to drive up to it. Indeed, I was in the absolute middle of nowhere, miles and miles of desert, without another soul in sight. The heat was unbearable, even as evening approached. The building looked abandoned. I wanted to look inside, but suddenly noticed a rattlesnake's tail barely visible, coiled behind the door. Behind the building was an old outhouse, just as neglected as the rest of the place. But it could serve my purpose, so I wouldn't have to relieve myself under the scorching sun. I checked for snakes inside and entered. The stomach pain was tolerable, but suddenly I heard something. Someone was approaching. I clearly heard the footsteps of 2 people. They walked around the abandoned store, then came closer to where I was. He went in. He went in there, 2 voices said. "Let's wait here. Let's wait for him here," they repeated, as if completing each other's thoughts. I froze. Had I trespassed on private property? In such a desolate place, far from any houses or other people, an argument was definitely not the best option. I called out loudly that I had an emergency situation, that I was just using the bathroom, and if necessary, I'd pay for it. There was no answer. "Hide. Let's wait for him. Let's hide and wait here," they whispered again. I quickly scanned the small space. Nothing I could use to defend myself. I calculated how many yards to my car, how many seconds it would take to run to it. Could I escape? There was no cell service. My phone showed no signal at all. A few minutes passed. I gathered my courage, opened the door, and bolted toward my car without looking back. When I reached it, I quickly started the engine. The road ahead was clear. I could drive away. But I didn't see anyone. I moved forward slowly, looking at the abandoned gas station on both sides. Nothing. Nobody. I returned to the same spot where I'd left my car, but kept the engine running. I opened the door. I was alone. It didn't seem like a place I should fear. Just a lonely building, a few yards from the road. The sun was beginning to set. Now the place even looked picturesque, perfect for a photo. I approached the store again, then the outhouse. And that's when I saw it. My own footprints in the sand. First light ones, those I left when I first approached to check out the place. Then deeper ones, those left when I ran to the car. But nothing else. No other footprints. No signs of the 2 people I'd heard. This confused me so much that I walked around the building again, looking in all possible hiding spots. But there was only desert around. Nothing more. The voices I heard weren't like a dream or hallucination. They sounded clear. They saw me. I drove away from there, still not understanding what had happened. My friends say it was probably just the heat, maybe a mirage or hallucination. My brother believes it could have been the spirits of those who once lived in that place, angered that I intruded on their territory. And my grandmother used to say that everything in this world has its sign, its meaning. That something made me stop at that particular place and stay there a few seconds longer for a reason. I'll leave the final word to you. I know my story doesn't sound that scary, but believe me, being there, feeling it firsthand, it was chilling, as if it wasn't the middle of the day, but the deepest part of night. My father spent his entire life behind the wheel, driving taxis, trucks, buses, and working as a personal chauffeur. The road was his home, and through his travels, he came to know every corner of the country. Today, I want to tell you about what happened when I first accompanied him on a long-distance haul for a shipping company owned by his friend. A company that, unfortunately, no longer exists. The job was straightforward. Pick up the truck from the depot, drive to the specified address where a crew would load it in less than an hour, and then head off to another city or state, sometimes hundreds of miles away. Upon arrival, local workers would be waiting to unload everything. Occasionally, he'd carry cargo on the return trip, but usually, it was just a simple two-way journey. This was his side gig. His main job was driving for Lyft, which had just launched its services in Arizona that year. I'm not exaggerating when I say his life was on the road. Growing up, I thought I'd follow in his footsteps. School didn't interest me much. All I wanted was to become a driver like my dad, even though he worked tirelessly to provide me with different opportunities. He didn't consider driving a particularly dignified or well-paying career, especially as an interstate trucker. My father wanted me to have options and to choose driving if I wanted, rather than being forced into it like he was, having started before he was even of legal age. Still, he never discouraged me when, as a child, I talked about working with him someday, when all I asked for were toy cars and steering wheels. That's why he often took me on short trips, first around town and later beyond city limits. I was 15 when he first took me on one of those long-haul journeys. We needed to deliver furniture to a penthouse near Sedona, in a particularly beautiful area whose name escapes me now. But it was an exclusive neighborhood far from downtown, a newly constructed building. The apartment must have been enormous to accommodate everything we were transporting. Security was incredibly strict. They made us wait for clearance to begin unloading, even though the movers already had the keys and were ready to go. We started so late that I even helped with the unloading to finish before dawn, since we couldn't afford to stay overnight, and there wasn't enough room to sleep in the truck. Once we finished, we headed back home. Now comes the part of the story that compelled me to share this with you. Unlike many tales involving bad premonitions or strange feelings signaling danger ahead, we were actually in excellent spirits. My father took me to a diner he knew that served the best apple pie in the state. I deserved it, he said. The apartment owners had tipped him generously, and we were both feeling good. Dad mentioned he wanted me to see what the highways looked like at night. We set off on our return journey. I fell asleep for a few hours and woke up around 3 a.m. I had promised Dad I'd talk to him to keep him from dozing off, as he looked exhausted. But when I awoke, he was fully alert and focused on the road. I asked if everything was okay, and he said yes, suggesting I go back to sleep, but I insisted I could stay up a while longer. We reached a rest stop where there wasn't a single vehicle and pulled over. My father rushed to the restroom while I stayed in the truck. He told me not to get out under any circumstances, even if he was with me. I found this strange, but didn't think much of it at the time. While he was gone, I noticed a woman approaching us. She wore a large gray poncho and a long skirt. She moved so slowly, as if she couldn't lift her feet properly, and when she turned her head toward me, I felt her noticing me. She came up to the truck and, smiling, mouthed the words, "Open up." She looked ancient, almost decrepit. Her eyes were heavily hooded, but she kept smiling. I said nothing and tried to ignore her. She moved to the driver's door and knocked twice. I heard her trying to open the door, but thankfully, my father had left the keys inside, and the doors were locked. I tried to look through the mirror, but couldn't see anything. It felt like she might have crawled under the truck. When my father returned, I told him everything, but he simply checked beneath the vehicle and said everything was fine, without asking any questions. He didn't ask what I'd seen. His reaction surprised me. I thought he might consider it a ghost, but he seemed indifferent. We continued our journey, and at some point, as we approached 3 in the morning, I noticed Dad slowing down and scanning the road intently, as if searching for something. He slowed to a crawl, and then came to a complete stop. That's when I saw a small child on the roadside, waving at us. "Help me," the child kept repeating. My father paid no attention and seemed reluctant to stop. He only stopped after I heard the child saying the same thing, but now from a different spot, closer to the truck. Looking back on it, my father simply said, "Never stop, never let anyone in, even if it's a child or an elderly woman. Nothing good happens on these highways between 3 and 4 a.m. That phrase has stayed with me ever since. Maybe it was a trap or just a phantom, but I've never forgotten what happened. Since then, I've always tried to avoid traveling between 3 and 4 in the morning. But here's what still haunts me to this day, something I didn't realize until years later. My father never turned his head toward the child. Not once. When I asked him about it last Thanksgiving, he just stared at me with a strange look and said, "What child?" I stopped because there was a coyote on the road. You must have been dreaming. But I know what I saw, and sometimes, on lonely nights, I can still hear that child's voice calling out from somewhere in the darkness. In my travels across the American heartland, I've witnessed countless strange things, and honestly, that's what I love most about this profession. All the unusual sights you encounter while traversing those endless stretches of asphalt. But there was one experience I had that I've never seen again, and frankly, hope I never will. It happened on Route 66, somewhere in the Badlands of New Mexico. The digital clock on my dashboard read 2:37 a.m., and a harvest moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie amber glow across the desert landscape. I was keeping my speed moderate, around 55 mph, fighting off the drowsiness that comes with these overnight hauls. That's when I felt it. Something solid struck the front of my Peterbilt, and I distinctly felt both axles roll over, whatever it was. I didn't stop immediately. Any seasoned trucker knows that desolate roads at that hour can be dangerous. There have been reports of gangs using roadkill or even fake accidents as bait to ambush truckers and steal their cargo, or worse. So I kept driving, but about 3 miles down the road, I noticed something wasn't right. The wheels started to lose traction, and there was this scraping sound coming from underneath. It wasn't mechanical, it was organic somehow, like something wet dragging against metal. I figured something might have gotten caught in the undercarriage, so I started looking for a safe place to pull over. Eventually, I spotted the neon lights of Dusty's all-night diner, glowing like a beacon in the darkness. I pulled into the empty parking lot, grabbed my heavy-duty maglite from the glove compartment, and climbed down to inspect the damage. When I shined that light underneath my rig, I wished to God I hadn't. There was a creature clinging to the chassis, something that had no business existing in our world. Its body was covered in coarse, matted fur that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. Its limbs, all 6 of them, were unnaturally long and jointed in ways that defied anatomy, ending in curved talons that had dug deep into the metal of my truck. But it was the face that haunts me still. Where eyes should have been, there were just hollow sockets filled with what looked like oil, but moved like it was alive. And when those sockets turned toward my light, the thing let out a sound, not animal, not human, somewhere between radio static and a child's scream. It detached itself in one fluid motion, bearing rows of translucent teeth that seemed to glow from within. Then it bolted toward the scrubland beyond the parking lot, moving in a sideways scuttle that no creature should be capable of, leaving behind a viscous trail that smelled like copper and rot. I ran into Dusty's, shaking so hard I could barely speak. The night cook and the 2 truckers at the counter stared at me like I'd lost my mind. One of them, an older guy named Jenkins, with leathery skin and eyes that had seen too much road, just shook his head and muttered something about desert fever. When I finally gathered enough courage to go back outside, I saw it, a thin, iridescent streak that looked black in the moonlight, but gleamed with an oily rainbow sheen under my flashlight. The trail led from the highway straight to where my truck was parked, then disappeared into the desert. I've hauled freight across all 48 contiguous states since then, but I've never seen anything like that creature again. Sometimes, though, on particularly dark nights when I'm driving through remote areas, I swear I can hear something scratching at the underside of my rig, trying to get in. When you're new to this line of work, you hear all sorts of tales from veteran drivers. Each one claims they've seen a ghost, a bizarre animal, or even UFOs out on those lonely stretches. Everyone has a story to tell. And now, with over 15 years of experience under my belt, I can assure you that most of these stories, mine included, are absolutely true. The highways of America hide secrets in their shadows, secrets that only reveal themselves to those who spend their lives in transit, suspended between destinations. What I'm about to tell you happened during my 2nd year, working as a long-haul trucker. Back in 2017, I was regularly crossing the Midwest, knew my routes like the back of my hand. And if the weather or other external factors didn't interfere, I always managed to deliver my cargo on time. During one of these runs, I stopped at a roadside diner called Pinewood Rest Stop, just outside of Lakeville, before heading to my next destination, Springfield. I remember ordering their signature black coffee and apple pie, which the waitress, Doris, insisted was the best in 3 counties. After finishing my meal, I climbed back into my rig, pulled onto Interstate 71. And for the first 3 hours of the drive, everything was completely normal. But as I continued driving, somewhere around the 5th hour, I realized I hadn't seen any familiar landmarks for a while, those helpful signs that let you know where you are, and how much further to the next town. This was supposed to be a 6-hour journey, but the landscape I found myself in showed no indications that I was approaching a city. I started paying more attention to my surroundings and noticed that wherever I looked, there was only darkness. And along the highway, I could see the trees of a dense forest that definitely wasn't supposed to be on this route. Had I somehow taken a wrong turn? It was a terrifying moment. This made absolutely no sense, because this stretch of highway had no major junctions that could have confused me. Trying to find some answers, I turned off the podcast I was listening to and attempted to tune in to a local radio station, but the device couldn't pick up any signal. I grabbed my phone from the passenger seat and got the same result: no service. Not even emergency calls would go through. From that point on, I kept driving, and I swear I continued for at least another 10 hours. The fuel gauge barely moved though, which made no sense. I was exhausted, hungry, increasingly disoriented, and frankly, scared out of my mind. Many times I considered pulling over and waiting for another vehicle to pass. But I drove for so long, without seeing any other cars, that it started to feel like I was the last person on Earth. I repeatedly tried using the radio and phone, but both devices seemed completely dead. Even my digital dashboard clock had frozen at 11:42 p.m. without any explanation. The road seemed endless, stretching infinitely into the darkness. I felt like I was trapped in some kind of loop, like a glitch in reality. I wondered if I might be dreaming, caught in some terrible nightmare. I even considered the possibility that I had crashed and was now lying unconscious somewhere on the road, experiencing hallucinations before death. But none of that was true. Then I noticed something strange in my rearview mirror, a faint glow that shouldn't have been there. The glow grew brighter, but not in a way that felt threatening. It was more like a presence. As it intensified, I suddenly felt something similar to when your ears pop on an airplane, and you start hearing more clearly, not realizing you weren't hearing properly before. In that instant, my radio tuned itself to a station playing American Pie. Headlights appeared in the distance behind me, and even the sky turned from pitch black to a deep navy blue, contrasting with the complete darkness that had surrounded me just moments before. The highway signs reappeared, showing I was just 15 miles outside of Springfield. When I finally arrived at the delivery depot, I checked my logs. According to everything, my truck's mileage, fuel consumption, the clock, I hadn't lost a single minute of time. My phone battery had exactly the level of charge you'd expect after a 6-hour trip, and I arrived precisely when I was scheduled to. The only thing that had changed was what I remembered and what I had experienced. It took me months before I worked up the courage to tell this story, but when I finally shared it with 2 fellow drivers at the Red Wheel Truck stop outside of Cleveland, one of them quietly chuckled and with the most respectful tone said, "Ah, I see you've experienced the vanishing mile already." They explained that this phenomenon happens to drivers traveling the same roads for extended periods, particularly on that stretch of I-71. Apparently, not everyone experiences it, but enough do that it has become one of the hundreds of legends among truckers. They called it the Vanishing Mile, or sometimes the Ghost Highway. What was most unsettling was when the older driver, Pete, showed me a small notebook he kept in his jacket. In it were the names and dates of other drivers who had experienced the same thing, going back to the 1970s. Some of their experiences were identical to mine, while others had seen or heard things in that strange limbo that I hadn't. Pete looked me in the eyes and said, "Consider yourself lucky. Some folks who enter the Vanishing Mile don't come back the same, if they come back at all. I've driven that route 17 times since then. Every time, I feel my hands grip the wheel a little tighter as I approach that stretch of highway. So far, it hasn't happened again. But sometimes, late at night, my radio will briefly lose signal for just a second or two. And in those moments, I hold my breath." At Horizon Logistics, I won't say more than that it's one of America's largest interstate shipping companies. We have this one semi-truck that's haunted. Everyone knows it, from the rookies to upper management, but nobody talks about it officially. How I found out about it still gives me chills, because I experienced it firsthand. Back in the winter of 2019, I was assigned to drive rig number 317, nicknamed Midnight by the veterans. From the moment I climbed into the cab, strange things started happening. The satellite radio would flip between stations by itself, sometimes landing on frequencies that weren't even part of our subscription package. From these dead channels came whispers, distorted voices speaking words I couldn't quite make out, but they sounded like they were calling my name. Mason. Mason, the cab always maintained this bone-chilling coldness that penetrated through your clothes and into your skin. This happened regardless of the weather outside, whether it was snowing in Montana or blazing hot crossing through Arizona. Even with the heater cranked to maximum, that unnatural cold never dissipated. You'd think the cold might be welcome during those summer hauls through Death Valley, but there was something wrong about it. It felt like being watched through the chill. The worst, though the absolute worst, happened when you were driving along those empty stretches of highway at 3 a.m. While keeping your eyes on the road, you'd inevitably notice something in your peripheral vision. A passenger sitting in the seat beside you. Someone who wasn't there when you started your journey. Someone who vanished the instant you turned your head. After the third time this happened, I tried to outsmart whatever it was. I kept my focus dead ahead and tried to make out details from the corner of my eye without turning my head. That was the biggest mistake of my life. As I stared forward, concentrating on the empty Nevada highway stretching before me, I realized the figure was staring directly at me. Its eyes, if you could call them that, were impossibly deep, like looking into two wells that dropped straight to hell. I noticed it had no nose, just a gaping, jagged hole in the center of its face that seemed to breathe in even when nothing was exhaled. I tried closing my eyes for just a second, hoping it would disappear. But when I opened them, it remained, now leaning slightly closer. What terrified me most was when it slowly raised a gray, shriveled hand. and pointed toward an upcoming exit I hadn't planned to take. I swerved sharply back into my lane when I realized I'd been drifting. By the time I'd recovered, the figure was gone, but the exit sign I passed read "Deadfall, no services." A town that doesn't exist on any map I've checked since. According to Blake, our fleet manager, this entity has been with the truck since it rolled off the assembly line in Detroit. The first driver quit after one trip, and since then, dozens have requested transfers after just a single route with Midnight. Some say the truck was built with steel from a recycled prison transport that crashed, killing everyone aboard. Others believe the land where the manufacturing plant stands was once the site of forgotten Native American burial grounds. Whatever the truth, the company isn't spending money to exorcise it or scrap the perfectly functional rig. So we all just pray to whatever gods might be listening that our name doesn't come up on the rotation for Rig 317. Because once you're behind that wheel, Midnight's passenger decides where you're really going. And sometimes, drivers report entire hours of their journey that they can't remember at all. I've been hauling freight across this country for nearly 40 years, and in all that time, I've seen plenty of strange things on the road. But something truly supernatural. That happened just once. It was the summer of 2008. I was driving a route through Nevada, heading toward Las Vegas with a trailer full of electronics. The weather had been clear all day, but as evening approached, the skies darkened unnaturally fast. Within minutes, a sandstorm kicked up, not uncommon in that part of the desert. But this one was different. The sand whipped against my windshield with such force I thought the glass might crack. My visibility dropped to almost nothing. I slowed to a crawl, desperately trying to stay on the asphalt. Over the CB radio, I heard scattered reports from other truckers that a section of Route 95 had completely washed out about 10 miles ahead. A flash flood had torn right through the highway, leaving a 20-foot gap. Highway patrol was redirecting traffic, but it would add hours to everyone's journey. I started to worry. My delivery was time-sensitive, and a major detour would put me well behind schedule. That's when I heard it, a voice cutting through the static on Channel 19. It was faint and kept breaking up, but the message was clear, if any. Drivers heading south. There's an unmarked access road. Mile marker 137. Bypass the washout. Save you 3 hours. The voice didn't identify itself, which was unusual for CB chatter. I checked my map. There was nothing marked at mile marker 137, but I was approaching it fast. Through the swirling sand, I just barely made out a dirt turnoff. Something told me to take it. I made the turn, and almost immediately, the sandstorm began to subside. Within minutes, the air was clear, and stars twinkled overhead as if there had never been a storm at all. The dirt road was surprisingly smooth, well maintained. I figured it must be some local shortcut, maybe used by ranchers or mining operations. Hours passed and the road stretched on. Now that I think about it, I should have found it strange that I hadn't passed a single vehicle, hadn't seen a single light from a distant ranch house or town. The desert around me was completely still, empty in a way that felt almost deliberate. Fatigue started to set in around midnight. My eyelids grew heavy, and I knew I needed to find a place to pull over soon. That's when I saw it, a massive neon sign glowing electric blue against the night sky. Crossroads Truck Haven, 24-hour service. I couldn't believe my luck. The place looked busy too. At least a dozen rigs parked in the lot. Lights on in the restaurant. Figures moving between the buildings. I pulled in, parked in an empty spot at the far end of the lot, and didn't even bother to check in. I was dead on my feet. I crawled into my sleeper cab, drew the curtains, and was out before my head hit the pillow. When I woke up, the sun was high in the sky. My watch said 1:30 p.m. I'd slept much longer than intended. I sat up quickly, worried about my delivery timeline, and pulled back the curtain to look outside. What I saw still haunts me to this day. I wasn't in a truck stop. I was in the middle of the desert, surrounded by what looked like an automotive graveyard. Rusted-out truck cabs from the 50s and 60s formed a rough circle around me. Their windows were all shattered, seats torn out, and some had strange symbols painted on their doors in what looked disturbingly like dried blood. The ground wasn't asphalt, but cracked desert hardpan, and scattered all around were small animal skeletons, dozens of them, arranged in patterns that seemed too deliberate to be natural. I started my engine with shaking hands and had to maneuver carefully between the derelict trucks to find a way out. As I pulled away, I checked my mirrors repeatedly, but there was no sign of the brightly lit truck stop, the neon sign, or any of the other trucks I'd seen the night before. I drove nonstop until I reached Vegas, 2 hours later. When I finally delivered my cargo, I asked the warehouse manager if he'd ever heard of Crossroads Truck Haven. The look he gave me made my blood run cold. "Where'd you hear that name?" he asked, voice suddenly quiet. I told him about the dirt road off mile marker 137. He shook his head slowly. "There's no mile marker 137 on Route 95, he said. "And you don't want to go looking for Crossroads. The stories I've heard. Truckers pull in, but not everyone pulls out. Some say it only appears every 7 years, always during a storm. Always to drivers who are desperate to make good time. I've never taken an unmarked shortcut since, and I never drive that stretch of Nevada alone. Sometimes, late at night, my CB will catch a burst of static, and in it, I think I hear a voice inviting weary drivers to rest at a haven just up ahead. I switch channels immediately. Some havens are designed to keep you forever." I hadn't been driving long haul for much time, and I don't have any stories about phantom highways or Route 66 or anything like that. But I do remember one particular night when I saw something that still haunts me to this day. I was hauling freight through Wyoming, heading west on Route 17. It was during that bitter winter of '97, and the darkness was absolute that night. No moon, no stars, no highway lights, nothing, but pitch black beyond the reach of my truck's headlights cutting through the snow flurries. Around 2 a.m., I spotted something strange lying across the road ahead. I slowed down to maneuver around it. As I passed by, my brain couldn't quite process what I'd just seen in that brief flash of light. What the hell was that? I thought to myself. I pulled over about 50 yards ahead and sat there for a minute, debating whether I should check it out or just keep moving. Curiosity got the better of me. I threw my heavy jacket on, grabbed my maglite from the glove compartment and stepped out into the biting cold. The wind was howling something fierce as I trudged back down the highway, the beam of my flashlight bouncing with each step. The temperature must have been well below zero, and I could see my breath hanging in clouds before my face. When I reached the spot and pointed my light down at the road, I froze. There on the asphalt was what looked like a human torso. No head, no limbs, and completely skinned. The flesh torn apart in several places. I stood there slack-jawed, unable to move or think clearly. The only sounds were the distant rumble of my truck's idling engine and the whipping of the wind through the nearby pine trees. Steam was rising from the mass of meat and bone, and there were no clothes or shoes anywhere, just a rib cage with other bones, and what looked like tendons and chunks of flesh strewn across the lane. My first instinct was to call the sheriff's department. The rib cage was definitely large enough to be human, maybe somebody about my size. But when I pulled out my phone, I had no signal, and the nearest town, Blackwater Ridge, was at least 50 miles away. As I was putting my phone back in my pocket, I happened to glance up toward the tree line on the side of the road. That's when I saw them, a cluster of glowing eyes watching me intently from the darkness of the forest. They weren't all at the same height, and they seemed to be shifting positions slowly, deliberately. That was all I needed to understand. I shouldn't be there. I figured it might be a pack of wolves that had been tracking me. Or maybe something else. Something worse. I backed away slowly toward my truck, never taking my eyes off those glowing orbs in the darkness. When I finally climbed back into my cab, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the key to put it in gear. I drove straight through until dawn without stopping once. To this day, I don't know if those were human remains or not, but I've convinced myself it was probably an elk that had been hit by another truck like mine, and then dragged off and partially eaten by predators before being dragged back onto the road. At least, that's what I tell myself when I'm trying to sleep at night. But sometimes, in my dreams, those eyes in the darkness aren't animal at all, and they're getting closer to the road with each passing second. It was 3 in the morning. After driving more than 14 hours straight through Nevada's endless desert highways, I decided it was finally time to pull over at a remote rest stop along Route 50, what locals call the loneliest road in America. The night was unusually cold for September, and when I rolled down my window, the silence was almost deafening. Through the windshield of my pickup truck, I could see a vast stretch of sagebrush, illuminated by an unnaturally large harvest moon. The silvery light cast long shadows across the landscape, and that's when I noticed it, a peculiar silhouette standing motionless about 50 yards from the parking area. At first, I figured it was just one of those metal art installations that dotted these desert highways. Some local artists attempt to spook travelers. I told myself it was nothing to worry about and decided to check my messages while I took a break. I started watching a short documentary on my phone, but something kept drawing my attention back to the window. There was a fleeting movement in my peripheral vision. I killed the cabin light to get a better look outside, and everything appeared normal. The figure was still there, unmoving. But something felt different. It seemed slightly closer to the rest stop than before. not dramatically so, but enough to notice the change. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the desert night air. The highway was practically deserted, with maybe one vehicle passing every 20 minutes. I tried to blame my uneasiness on exhaustion and highway hypnosis, forcing myself to focus on my phone instead of the growing urge to look outside again. About 15 minutes later, my bladder reminded me why I'd stopped in the first place. The growing sense of dread made me consider using an empty water bottle from the passenger seat, but that felt ridiculous. I was a 38-year-old man, not some scared kid. I reluctantly glanced back toward the sagebrush field. The figure was exactly where it should be, still as a statue. Gathering my courage, I stepped out, walked a few paces from my truck to a spot behind some sparse junipers, and took care of business. I hadn't been out there more than 30 seconds when the atmosphere somehow shifted. The night went from quiet to something I can only describe as completely void of sound. Even the distant hum of the occasional passing vehicle seemed to vanish. Every hair on my body stood up at once, and I felt an overwhelming compulsion to turn around. I told myself I was being absurd, that my imagination was simply working overtime after too many hours on the road. But the feeling was too powerful to ignore, less a conscious thought, and more like raw instinct clawing at my brain. When I finally turned around, the figure was gone. The emptiness that flooded my stomach made me lightheaded, as if all the blood in my body had suddenly rushed to my feet. I sprinted back to my truck, fumbling with the keys before practically throwing myself inside. I locked the doors, fired up the engine, and floored it back onto the highway. I didn't check my mirrors. I didn't look to either side. I just drove, keeping my eyes fixed on the road ahead, knuckles white against the steering wheel. I didn't stop again until I reached the brightly lit truck plaza in Ely, where at least a dozen other vehicles were parked. To this day, I've never pulled over at an isolated rest stop again. And believe me, I never will. Sometimes when I'm driving at night, I still catch myself scanning the darkness at the edge of my headlights, watching for something that shouldn't be there, and wondering what might have happened if I'd stayed just a few minutes longer at that rest stop on Route 50. My Uncle Jack was always on the road, driving his semi-truck across the country, and he'd come back with the strangest stories I've ever heard. One story in particular has stayed with me since I first heard it when I was 7 years old. It was the winter of 1978. Jack was hauling a load of electronics from Chicago to Los Angeles along Route 66. Usually, when he finished his deliveries, he'd spend a few days unwinding at local truck stops, playing cards with other drivers and having a few beers. But this time was different. He was trying to make it home in time for my cousin's wedding. So he pushed himself harder than usual, driving long stretches with minimal breaks. Somewhere in the New Mexico desert, around 3 a.m., exhaustion finally caught up with him. The roads were empty, the night was pitch black, and the nearest town was still about 40 miles away. Jack pulled over at a small rest area, just a gravel patch really, with a single flickering light post. He reclined his seat, set his alarm for 2 hours later, and quickly drifted off. He wasn't sure how long he'd been asleep when something woke him. It was singing a woman's voice, soft and melodic, but somehow Wrong. The notes were slightly off, like a record played at the wrong speed. At first, he thought his radio had turned on, but when he checked, everything was switched off. Just as suddenly as it started, the singing stopped. Then came a sound that made his blood run cold. A cry for help, desperate and choked, seemingly coming from somewhere near his truck. Jack sat up straight, instantly alert. His first instinct was to jump out and help, but something held him back. An uneasiness crept over him as he realized just how isolated he was miles from anywhere, surrounded by desert and darkness. "Hello," he called out, rolling down his window just a crack. "Is someone there?" No answer came, just the whistle of the wind through the desert scrub. He started the engine and turned on his high beams, illuminating the area around his truck. There was nothing but sand, tumbleweeds, and the occasional cactus casting long shadows. Jack grabbed his flashlight from the glove compartment. He was a good man, always willing to help others, and the thought that someone might be in trouble out there was gnawing at him. But just as he was about to open his door, he noticed something strange in his side mirror. A flicker of movement, something white, shifting between the shadows beyond the reach of his headlights. He adjusted the mirror, trying to get a better look, and that's when he saw her. A woman in a pale dress, standing perfectly still about 20 yards behind his truck. Jack squinted, trying to make out her features, but where her face should have been, there was only emptiness. Not darkness, not shadow, just nothing, like a blank space in reality itself. As he watched, frozen in horror, she began to glide toward the truck, not walking, but moving as if she were being pulled on invisible strings, her feet barely touching the ground. Jack didn't wait to see more. He slammed his foot on the accelerator, the tires kicking up gravel as the truck lurched forward. He drove nonstop for the next 4 hours, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his eyes constantly darting to the rearview mirror. When he finally told me this story years later, I was a teenager, old enough to appreciate the gravity of it. My uncle wasn't the type to scare easily. He was a Vietnam vet, built like a brick wall, with a booming laugh that filled every room he entered. But when he recounted that night on Route 66, his voice would drop to a whisper, and the color would drain from his face. What struck me most was how my Aunt Claire would react whenever he told this story. She'd quietly leave the room or change the subject. One Thanksgiving, after a few too many drinks, she confided in me. "In all the years I've known your uncle, I've only seen him truly afraid twice. Once when your cousin was born 3 months premature, and whenever he talks about that night in New Mexico." As the years went by, Jack told the story less and less. The last time I heard him mention, it was at my wedding reception. Someone had asked about his strangest experience on the road, and he started to tell the story, but stopped mid-sentence, his eyes distant. He just shook his head and said, "Some things are better left in the past." I don't know what my uncle encountered that night. Maybe it was exhaustion playing tricks on his mind. Maybe it was something that science can't explain. Or maybe it was something else entirely. But I do know that for him, what he saw in that desert, in the dead of night, was as real as the ground beneath his feet. And sometimes, when I'm driving alone at night on a deserted highway, I find myself checking my mirrors a little more often than I need to. My grandfather used to tell me about his days back in the 90s, when he would occasionally ride along with his buddy Jake, a long-haul trucker who had this strict rule about always parking his rig at exactly 2 a.m. to get some sleep, no matter where they were on the route. This one time, they were hauling through the Appalachian foothills in West Virginia on a stretch of road the locals called the Devil's Spine. It was mid-October, crisp autumn air settling into the valleys between those ancient mountains. Grandpa says he spotted these strange blue-green lights flickering deep in the ravine below them, like nothing he'd ever seen before. He mentioned it to Jake, who was already settling into his bunk in the cab. But Jake just mumbled something about swamp gas and turned over, dead to the world within seconds. Grandpa says he couldn't shake this feeling of being watched, even as he drifted off to sleep. Must have been around 3:30 a.m. when they both jolted awake to the sound of something, not quite knocking, more like scratching against the truck's door. Jake cursed and reached for the flashlight they kept wedged between the seats. When my grandfather peered out through the side window, he swears he saw 5 figures in what looked like old-fashioned miner's gear, complete with headlamps that gave off that same blue-green glow. But what made his blood run cold was what they were carrying between them. Not a coffin like you might expect, but what looked like an empty stretcher made of some kind of black metal that seemed to absorb the moonlight around it. Grandpa said he couldn't even scream at first, just grabbed Jake's arm so hard he left bruises. When Jake finally saw them too, he didn't hesitate, fired up that diesel engine so fast the whole truck shuddered. As they pulled away, Grandpa swears he felt the truck dip slightly, like something heavy had climbed aboard the back. They drove straight through until dawn, not daring to stop, both of them hearing occasional scraping sounds from the trailer that Jake tried to dismiss as just the wind or bad roads. When they finally pulled into a truck stop outside Charleston, they checked the rig over inch by inch. No blood, no damage to the tires or undercarriage. Nothing that would suggest they'd hit anything physical on that road. But on the back doors of the trailer, they found something that still gives my grandfather nightmares all these decades later. 3 perfect handprints pressed into the metal itself. Not painted on, but somehow melted into the steel, like someone with hands hot enough to warp metal had tried to claw their way inside. And strangest of all, when they opened those doors to check the cargo, every box had been shifted exactly 3 inches to the left. Grandpa says they never reported it, never told the company. Jake quit driving routes through the Appalachians after that night. And to this day, whenever we drive through mountains at night and my grandfather sees headlights behind us, he gets real quiet and keeps checking the rearview mirror until we're back on flat ground. I've been driving 18-wheelers for nearly 20 years, and back in the early 2000s, I spent a lot of time on overnight hauls. In those days, I heard and saw plenty of strange things on the road. But there's one experience that's burned into my memory like a cattle brand. I was driving a load up from Savannah to Charleston, along the coastal route through South Carolina. It was around 2 a.m., pitch black except for my headlights cutting through the darkness. The route took me through a stretch of marshland where the road narrows with nothing but swamp on either side for miles. That's when I first heard it faint at first, almost like a woman's voice calling out. My radio was playing some late-night talk show, but I could hear this sound underneath it. At first, I thought maybe it was interference, or something coming through on another frequency. I turned the radio down and slowed the rig, eventually pulling onto the shoulder. Something about that sound made my skin crawl, but I was worried someone might be hurt out there in the marsh, maybe a car accident victim or something. So I sat there in the darkness, listening. The cries grew louder, but now I realized it wasn't just a woman's voice. I could make out what sounded like children wailing and men shouting in pain. Goosebumps ran up my arms as a bone-deep chill settled over me. These weren't normal cries for help. They sounded like the damned souls you'd imagine in hell. I don't know what possessed me, but instead of getting the hell out of there like any sane person would, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped down from the cab. Maybe it was the adrenaline or some misguided sense of duty, but I started scanning the roadside while those terrible sounds continued. I was trying to pinpoint where they were coming from when my flashlight beam caught something up ahead in the middle of the road. It was a pale, glowing shape reflecting the light. My heart was hammering in my chest, but I didn't stop. I started walking slowly toward whatever it was, my boots feeling heavier with each step. The closer I got, the louder the sounds became. My hands were ice cold and shaking when I finally saw it clearly. I wanted to scream, but my voice was frozen in my throat. It looked like a dog or small animal on all fours, but it had no fur, just milk-white skin stretched tight over its frame. Its eyes were completely black, like polished obsidian, and they seemed to absorb my flashlight beam rather than reflect it. The thing looked like it was dying, breathing shallowly, its ribcage visible through that ghostly skin. But the worst part was its mouth, full of needle-sharp teeth, far too many for its jaw, and from that mouth came those horrible screams. It was as if dozens of people were trapped inside this thing, all crying out in agony. I don't remember exactly how, but the next thing I knew, I was flying north on the highway at top speed, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles were white. When I finally reached Charleston and told my buddy Jake at the truck stop what happened, he crossed himself and said I'd encountered a swamp siren. Something the local Gullah people believed lured travelers to their deaths in the marshes. Everyone I've told has a different explanation. Some say it was a government experiment gone wrong. Others think it was an alien creature. A few are convinced it was a demon. All I know is that no natural animal makes sounds like that. And sometimes, when I'm driving that stretch at night, I still keep the radio turned up extra loud, just to drown out anything else I might hear. Back in the early 2000s, I was working as a delivery driver in northern Michigan. One winter night, I was heading up to Traverse City with medical supplies that needed to be delivered before morning. It was around 2 a.m., and the temperature had dropped well below freezing. I was driving along Pine Ridge Road, one of those winding, narrow routes cutting through dense forest where your headlights are the only thing keeping the darkness at bay. The snowfall had just stopped, leaving everything covered in this pristine white blanket that reflected my high beams back at me. About halfway through my route, I noticed something unusual on the shoulder of the road. At first, I thought it was a moose. They're common up there, and occasionally they get hit by vehicles. But as I got closer, I could see there was someone hunched over the moose carcass. My first thought was, some hunter is out here in the middle of the night trying to salvage antlers. In this weather. But when I slowed down a bit, I realized there were actually 3 figures around the moose, not just one. They were tearing into the animal's stomach cavity and pulling out entrails, bringing the steaming organs to their mouths with an urgency that made my skin crawl. The vapor from the fresh kill rose around them in the freezing air, creating this surreal, nightmarish tableau. One of them, the largest, sensed my approach. It turned and looked directly at me, not at my truck, but at me, like it knew exactly where I was sitting behind the wheel. It slowly stood upright, and that's when I realized this thing was enormous, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, with shoulders twice as broad as mine. Its body was covered in something that wasn't quite fur and wasn't quite clothing, more like matted hair with ice and snow crusted throughout. I didn't even consider stopping. In fact, I pressed the accelerator harder, but not so hard that I'd lose control on the icy road. As I passed by, the creature didn't run or hide like an animal would. Instead, it deliberately stepped toward the road, coming alongside my driver's side window. The worst part, the detail that still gives me nightmares 15 years later, was that as it walked beside my moving vehicle for those few terrifying seconds, it kept pace perfectly while staring straight into my eyes. Its face was largely hidden by the hair and shadows, but I could clearly see its eyes reflecting my headlights with an eerie amber glow. There was intelligence there and something else. Recognition, maybe. Like it had been waiting for someone to come along. The other 2 creatures remained by the carcass, but they too had stopped feeding and were watching my truck pass by. They were smaller, maybe juveniles, but had the same general appearance. In my rearview mirror, I saw the large one standing in the middle of the road, tracking my departure until I rounded a bend and lost sight of it. I radioed the state police when I hit the next town, but when they sent a patrol out at dawn, they found nothing. No moose carcass, no footprints, nothing but unmarked snow. Some locals at the diner where I stopped for coffee that morning told me I'd encountered the Wendigo forest people. But I don't know about all that. What I do know is that there are things in those northern woods that don't match anything in any biology textbook I've ever seen. And when I drive through Michigan now, I stick to the interstate, even if it adds hours to my journey. Some shortcuts aren't worth taking. I once tried my hand at becoming a long-haul trucker. Luckily for me, it didn't pan out. I'd only been on the job for a week when I was assigned to shadow one of the most experienced drivers at Mason-Dixon Freight Lines. The guy, let's call him Earl, was pushing 70, with nearly 45 years behind the wheel of heavy rigs. He had this weathered face that seemed to tell 1,000 stories of the open road. Everything was going smoothly on Route 66. We were cruising through the Arizona desert just after midnight, talking about previous jobs and endless journeys, when our conversation was suddenly interrupted by a violent banging sound, accompanied by desperate cries for help coming from the trailer behind us. A woman's voice, terrified and pleading. My blood ran cold. I immediately thought I'd made a terrible mistake and got myself mixed up in some kind of human trafficking operation. But Earl just kept his eyes on the road, not even flinching. Don't pay it no mind, he said flatly. Just ignore it and it'll be over soon enough. About 20 miles later, I heard those sounds again, but fainter this time. I couldn't take it anymore and called back. "Don't worry. Everything will be okay. It'll all be over soon." Earl slammed his hand against the steering wheel so hard I thought he might break it. "You goddamn fool," he shouted, his face contorted with rage. "Now she'll never leave you alone." He didn't speak another word to me for the rest of the drive. When we stopped at a truck stop in Flagstaff, I decided I'd had enough. I grabbed my duffel bag while Earl was in the restroom and hitched a ride with another trucker heading back east. I returned to my apartment in Nashville and quit that job the next day. I wasn't about to get involved in anything illegal. A couple weeks later, I started working for Blue Ridge Transport, figuring a change of company would help. My first solo run was supposed to be a simple overnight haul from Nashville to Louisville. I'd barely made it to the Kentucky state line when I heard that familiar voice from the trailer. "Help. Somebody please help me." And Earl was right. For the next 3 months, she never left me alone. Every single haul, day or night, those cries would start up after I'd been on the road for about an hour. Sometimes they were loud enough to be heard over my radio at full volume. Other times they were just whispers that seemed to be right behind my ear in the cab. I lasted longer than I should have, thinking it would eventually stop. But one night on a lonely stretch of highway in West Virginia, I heard a scratching on the back of my cab, like fingernails dragging across metal, and a hoarse voice whispering, "Let me in, driver. I'm so cold out here." That was it for me. I pulled into the next rest stop, left the keys in the ignition, and called a taxi. I've been working as a dispatcher for the past 6 years now, and to be perfectly honest, I have no problems whatsoever with never hitting the open road again. I'm about to tell you something that happened to my father back in 1987, something he's never been able to explain. He was a long-haul trucker driving routes through the Appalachian Mountains, mostly between Tennessee and Virginia. This particular night, he was making his way through a stretch of Route 77 known for its sharp turns and steep drops. It was around 3 in the morning, that peculiar hour when the world feels suspended between yesterday and tomorrow. A light fog had settled in the valleys, creeping across the road like ghostly fingers reaching out from the forest. My father, Jim, had been driving for nearly 14 hours straight, stopping only for coffee and to stretch his legs. The radio kept cutting in and out as the mountains interfered with the signal, so he was humming to himself to stay alert. As he rounded a bend near what locals called Widow's Peak, his headlights caught something unexpected, a woman standing at the edge of the road. She couldn't have been more than 25 years old, with pale skin that seemed to glow in the darkness. She wore a cream-colored dress that billowed slightly in the night breeze, despite there being no wind that night. My father immediately slowed down, thinking she must be stranded. In those days before cell phones, breaking down on a mountain road in the middle of the night was a dangerous situation. He was about to pull over when something happened that still haunts him to this day. The woman suddenly turned toward his truck, made direct eye contact with him, her eyes reflecting the headlights with an unnatural brightness, and then deliberately stepped into the path of his 18-wheeler. There was no time to swerve on that narrow mountain road. He felt the sickening thud as his truck struck her body. He heard what sounded like bones shattering beneath his wheels. The sound was so distinct, so horrifying, that he can still hear it when he wakes up in the middle of the night, even now, decades later. My father slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a stop about 50 feet past where he'd hit her. His hands were shaking so badly, he could barely pull the emergency brake. By some miracle, 2 other vehicles were on that desolate stretch of road, a pickup truck and a station wagon, and they both stopped immediately. The 3 drivers converged at the spot where the accident had occurred. My father was nearly hysterical, explaining through a trembling voice what had happened. The other 2 drivers, a middle-aged couple from North Carolina named the Hendersons, and a logger called Mac, nodded grimly. They had seen the whole thing from their vantage points further up the road. "Wasn't your fault, buddy," Mac said, his flashlight beam cutting through the fog. "We both saw her jump right in front of you. Clear as day. She wanted to get hit, Mrs." Henderson added, clutching her husband's arm. "No question about it." With dread knotting his stomach, my father knelt down to look beneath the truck, bracing himself for the gruesome sight that surely awaited him. But there was nothing. No body. No blood. Not even a scrap of that cream-colored dress. The 3 of them searched the area for nearly an hour, combing the ditches alongside the road, checking the undercarriage of my father's truck multiple times. They found absolutely nothing to indicate a human being had been struck. "This ain't right," Mac kept muttering, his eyes darting nervously to the tree line. "I saw her plain as I'm seeing you now, Mrs." Henderson had gone completely silent, her face ashen in the beam of the flashlights. Her husband suggested they all drive to the nearest town and report the incident, but there was a strange reluctance in his voice. Before they could decide what to do, Mrs. Henderson suddenly gasped and pointed toward the forest edge. My father swears that for just a moment, a split second that stretched into eternity, he saw the woman standing among the trees, watching them with that same unnaturally bright gaze. And then she was gone. The Hendersons left first, their taillights quickly disappearing around the bend. Mac mumbled something about getting home to his family and took off shortly after. My father sat in his truck for what felt like hours, unable to process what had happened. He filed a report at the next town, but without a body or any evidence, there wasn't much the local sheriff could do. 2 weeks later, my father received a letter from the Hendersons. They'd researched the area and discovered that in 1942, a young woman named Eleanor Simmons had taken her own life at that exact spot after learning her fiancé had been killed in the war. My father never drove that stretch of Route 77 again. He'd take detours adding hundreds of miles to his journeys, just to avoid Widow's Peak. When I asked him once why he was so certain he'd hit something when there was no evidence, he just looked at me with eyes that had seen things they couldn't understand. "Some things you know in your bones," he said quietly, "and some memories stick to your soul like burrs that can never be brushed away." I was driving through the Appalachian foothills on a moonless October night, the kind of darkness that swallows your headlights after just a few yards. Route 47 is notorious for its blind curves and steep embankments, but I traveled it dozens of times hauling lumber from the Blackwater Mills to Charleston. Around 3 in the morning, when even the night creatures had gone silent, I spotted headlights in the distance, piercing through the fog that had settled in the valley. Something about those lights immediately set off alarms in my mind. They were weaving, drifting across the yellow line with increasing frequency. As the distance between us closed, my knuckles went white against the steering wheel. The oncoming vehicle, a dark sedan that had seen better days, was now fully in my lane, barreling toward me at a speed that defied reason on these treacherous roads. I downshifted my 18-wheeler and veered right, the massive tires of my double trailer scraping against the guardrail. I flashed my high beams frantically, hoping to snap the driver out of whatever stupor they were in. The sedan didn't alter its course, not even slightly. With the stone face of the mountain to my right and a 50-foot drop to the Blackwater River on my left, my options disappeared in seconds. I blasted my horn, the sound echoing through the valley like a wounded animal's cry. We were now mere seconds from impact. My headlights fully illuminated the interior of the approaching car, and what I saw haunts me to this day. The driver, a young man with dark, disheveled hair, wearing what looked like a suit with the tie loosened, wasn't panicking. He wasn't frantically turning the wheel or screaming in fear. He was smiling, not a nervous smile, not the grimace of someone making a terrible mistake. It was a smile of absolute serenity, of pure, unfiltered joy, like someone greeting a long-lost love after years of separation. His eyes, wide and glistening, stared directly at me, or perhaps through me, seeing something I couldn't. The impact came with a deafening crunch of metal and shattering glass. My truck jackknifed, the second trailer whipping around like the tail of an angry beast. When everything finally stopped moving, I was hanging upside down in my harness, my CB radio dangling above my head, static hissing from its speaker. By some miracle, I walked away with just a broken collarbone and some lacerations. The sedan and its driver weren't as fortunate. The vehicle had compacted to nearly half its original size upon impact with my first trailer. When Sheriff Callahan arrived with the paramedics and fire crew, I recounted everything while they worked to extract the driver's body from the wreckage. When I mentioned the smile, Sheriff Callahan's weathered face grew solemn. He took off his hat and ran his fingers through his thinning gray hair. Know something, son. In 27 years of law enforcement, I've seen this more times than I care to count, he said, his voice low enough that only I could hear. A lot of these single-vehicle crashes, these head-ons with semis or bridge abutments, they ain't accidents. He looked over at the wreckage, now illuminated by the harsh floodlights of the emergency vehicles. Some folks decide they're done with this world, but don't want their families bearing the weight of that decision. Or maybe they make the choice in an instant of darkness. Either way, they make it look like an accident. That night changed the way I drive, changed the way I look at approaching headlights. Sometimes, when I'm on a lonely stretch of highway and see lights coming toward me, I can't help but wonder about the person behind the wheel, what they're thinking, what they're feeling. And I remember that smile, that terrible smile of absolute peace, moments before catastrophe. I've been driving 18-wheelers across this country for nearly 2 decades now, and you hear all sorts of tales from the road. But what I'm about to tell you happened to me personally, just last autumn, on that lonely stretch of Route 17 that cuts through the Appalachian foothills. It was a foggy Thursday morning, around 5 or 6 a.m., when most folks are still wrapped in their dreams. The mist hung low over the asphalt, and I hadn't passed another vehicle for at least 40 minutes. I was hauling a load of electronics from Cleveland to Charleston, a route I'd driven maybe 100 times before. The radio was playing some old Johnny Cash tune, and I was sipping my second cup of coffee when I caught something in my side mirror. A silver sedan was approaching fast, and I mean unnaturally fast. One moment there was nothing behind me for miles, and the next, this car was practically riding my bumper. Now I've seen my share of speed demons on the highway, but something about this one made the hair on my neck stand up. The sedan pulled alongside my rig, and instinctively I glanced over to see who was in such a hurry at this ungodly hour. That's when my blood ran cold. There was no one behind the wheel. No one at all. At first, I figured it had to be some trick of the light, or the morning fog playing with my eyes. Maybe the driver was really short, or hunched down looking for something. But as the sedan pulled ahead of me, I got a clear view through the passenger window too. Empty, completely empty. It wasn't some fancy new self-driving car either. This was an older model Buick, probably from the early 90s. The kind without any of that advanced tech. And yet there it was, navigating the curves of Route 17 with perfect precision. No human guidance in sight. I eased off the gas a bit, trying to put some distance between us. That car gave me the creeps, and I wanted nothing to do with it. It sped ahead, disappearing around a bend, and I breathed a little easier. But 30 minutes later, as I rounded a sharp curve that opened up to a straightaway, I saw it again. The silver Buick was sitting motionless in the middle of the road, all 4 doors hanging wide open like some kind of bizarre butterfly. No hazard lights flashing, no driver or passengers anywhere to be seen. I slowed down to a crawl, my heart pounding against my ribs. The road was narrow, with steep embankments on either side, so I had to navigate carefully around the abandoned vehicle. As I passed by, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A child's teddy bear sitting upright on the back seat, as if placed there with purpose. I pressed the accelerator and didn't look back, but I swear I felt something watching me as I pulled away. When I reached the next truck stop, I called Highway Patrol to report the abandoned vehicle. They sent a trooper out, but when I followed up later, they claimed they found nothing. No silver Buick. No open doors. Nothing at all. To this day, I take the alternate route through Williamson when I'm heading south, adding an extra hour to my journey. I'm not usually one for ghost stories or superstitions, but sometimes, when I'm driving through fog in those early morning hours, I keep checking my mirrors. Part of me is afraid I'll see that silver sedan gaining on me again. And part of me knows that whatever was driving it that morning wasn't from this world. I've tried to rationalize it 1,000 different ways, but deep down, I know what I saw. Or rather, what I didn't see. And some things on the open road are better left unexplained. This happened to me about 15 years ago when I was working as a long-haul trucker. I was transporting raw materials across various parts of the Midwest. I can't speak for all my colleagues, but you see some pretty strange things on the road at night. Both my sister and I have plenty of similar stories, but today I'll share the one that affected us the most and has been impossible to forget. You see, that night my sister and I were driving along Route 17 from Nebraska into Iowa. We'd been on the road for several hours. I don't recall the exact time, but it was definitely well past midnight. We were talking and listening to the radio when suddenly we spotted silhouettes in the distance illuminated by a bright light. We could barely make anything out since everything was pitch black, but the truck's headlights are massive, which allowed us to see what was happening several yards ahead of us. The closer we got, the more we realized it was people flagging us down for help. I remember it clearly, a man and a woman. She was cradling what looked like a child, wrapped in a blanket. But the most terrifying part was that they were standing next to a completely burned-out station wagon. My sister said, "Pull over, we need to help them, there's a child." I immediately stopped and positioned the truck right in front of them, just a few yards from where they were standing. The man approached our truck, and I opened the door but didn't get out. From my seat, I asked what had happened and if everyone was okay, since the station wagon was completely destroyed. He replied that they were trying to get home, but had no way to travel without providing any more details. I responded, "Of course, we can take you to the nearest town, and I can lend you my phone if you want to call your family." He thanked me profusely, and with tears in his eyes said, "Thank you, I'll go get my wife." He walked away, and my sister and I waited in the truck. We were tidying up the cabin to make room because there was barely any space. When we finished preparing seats for them, we returned to our positions. I looked in the rearview mirror because they were taking a while, but there was nobody there anymore. My sister looked too, even opening the door for a better view. She asked, "Where did they go?" "They're gone." I got out of the truck and went to where the station wagon had been, but it was gone too. I raised my phone for light since it was so dark, searched the surroundings, looked everywhere, but couldn't find any trace of them. I returned to the truck and told my sister, who was also baffled, that they'd vanished. My sister, now frightened, said, "Let's get out of here." I started the engine and drove off. She was convinced we'd encountered the spirits of the dead. But I didn't believe in such things and didn't want to believe they were ghosts until 2 days later. We were resting at a truck stop in Cedar Falls, talking with another colleague who was also a trucker. We told him what happened, but he wasn't surprised. On the contrary, he reacted as if he'd seen them himself. He told us it was a family from Sioux City who had been intercepted by a group of criminals back in the 80s. A drug cartel tracked them down because the father had apparently been skimming product. Their bodies were found burned beyond recognition inside their vehicle. According to local legend, they sometimes appear asking for help, trying to get home. Other drivers, including him, had seen them, but they all knew better than to stop. Just say a prayer that they find their way to eternal peace. I couldn't believe it. It was incredibly difficult to process, but my sister immediately said, "See, I told you we met the souls of the dead." To this day, I remember the man's face with that terrible expression. I've never driven that stretch of Route 17 again, but I hope they eventually found peace. Sometimes when I'm driving at night and see headlights in my mirror, I can't help but wonder if there's more than just living travelers on these lonely highways. The road holds many secrets, and not all of them are meant for us to understand. Good evening. My name is Mike. I've been driving 18-wheelers across this country for more than 15 years now. And during those countless hours on the open road, especially during those long, lonely nights, I've experienced things that some might call paranormal. When you're cruising down endless highways at 3 in the morning with nothing but your thoughts and the occasional pair of headlights passing by, the line between reality and something else starts to blur. This is one story that still sends chills down my spine when I think about it. I was hauling a load from Burlington, Vermont, headed all the way down to Savannah, Georgia. It was early autumn, and the weather was turning cold up north. I pulled out of the distribution center around 7 in the evening. I wasn't tired at all since I'd just taken a long nap at the truck stop earlier that afternoon. So I figured I'd drive through the night and make good time while the highways were empty. Everything was going as usual. The roads were fairly deserted, just how I like them. But sometime after midnight, as I was passing through the mountains of western Pennsylvania, I noticed something strange in my side mirror. A silver-gray truck seemed to appear out of nowhere from a densely wooded area off the side of the highway. It just emerged from between the trees, where there wasn't even a road, and pulled onto the highway behind me. At first, I didn't think much of it. I figured it was just another driver who'd pulled off for a quick rest in a weird spot. But then it stayed behind me, maintaining the exact same distance. I was going pretty slow, climbing up through the mountain passes, and normally other trucks would signal and pass when they could. I flashed my lights to let them know it was safe to overtake me, and I even moved over slightly to give them more room. But this truck just stayed put, matching my speed perfectly. I thought maybe the driver was nervous about the mountain roads at night, or perhaps inexperienced with the steep grades. So I slowed down even more and signaled again for them to pass. But they just slowed down too, keeping that same distance behind me. By this point, I was starting to get annoyed. I couldn't figure out what this driver was up to, but I decided to ignore it and focus on my driving. 2 more hours passed like this. 2 whole hours. And that truck was still right there behind me, never getting closer, never falling back, never attempting to pass. It was as if it was attached to my rig by some invisible tether. I decided to pull into a truck stop to use the restroom, grab something to eat, and hopefully let this strange shadow truck continue on its way. But as I pulled off the exit, the silver-gray truck did the same. It didn't follow me into the truck stop, though. It just stopped on the shoulder of the exit ramp, with its headlights still blazing. I went inside, used the bathroom, and picked up a coffee and sandwich at the convenience store. When I came back out, that truck was still sitting there, waiting. The lights were on, but the engine was off. This really got under my skin. I decided to walk over and have a word with whoever was driving, find out if they were following me intentionally, or if this was some kind of stupid prank. I approached the truck and began knocking on the driver's side window. The windows were heavily tinted, much darker than legally allowed for commercial vehicles. I couldn't see a thing inside. I knocked harder and started yelling for the driver to roll down the window and tell me what their problem was, saying I wasn't a coward and to explain what they were doing. But the window stayed up. I shouted that if they kept following me, I'd radio ahead to my buddies down the road, and they'd help me put a stop to it. Suddenly, the truck's engine roared to life, and it lurched forward, nearly running over my foot. I jumped back, cursing loudly, but I was also relieved that I'd finally scared them off. Now I could continue my journey in peace. I climbed back into my cab and sat there for a few minutes, smoking a cigarette to calm my nerves. Then I pulled back onto the highway, and everything seemed normal again. The roads were dark and peaceful as I crossed into Maryland. It was approaching 3 in the morning when suddenly, that same silver-gray truck appeared behind me again, seemingly materializing out of the darkness. I couldn't believe it. This had to be some kind of sick joke. It was clear now that this was personal. This truck had been following me for over 3 hours. The driver obviously wanted something, so I decided I'd reach the next truck stop, about 25 minutes up the road, and ask for help from other truckers to confront this person and put an end to their game. I kept driving patiently with the truck still behind me, but then it began to accelerate, closing the distance between us. I thought it was finally going to pass me, so I slowed down a bit to give it room, but it slowed down too, and then pulled up alongside my rig. The driver's window was now directly parallel to mine, and I could feel that they were watching me. I honked and gestured for them to back off, because it was dangerous to drive like that. But then the truck started drifting closer to my lane. I didn't know what to do. I kept honking and yelling out my window, asking what the hell they were doing. Then I felt a jolt as the truck sideswiped my trailer. I lost control of the steering and veered off the road, crashing through a guardrail and plunging down a small embankment into a thick forest of pine trees. I wasn't hurt, thankfully, but my engine completely died, and when I tried to restart it, nothing happened. I reached for my CB radio, but it wasn't working either. I checked my cell phone, no signal. To be honest, I was starting to get scared. I was stranded in the middle of nowhere at 3 in the morning, with no way to call for help. As if that wasn't bad enough, I suddenly saw headlights approaching through the trees, and my heart nearly stopped when I realized it was the same silver-gray truck that had been following me all night. It pulled up behind my disabled rig and shut off its engine and lights. I locked my door and grabbed the hunting knife I always carry with me. The only thing I could think was that this might be some kind of carjacking crew targeting truckers, especially since this was a notoriously dangerous stretch of highway. But after about 5 minutes, nobody got out. I decided to step down from my cab and confront the driver, to tell them to leave me alone and go away. I slowly approached the truck with my knife in my pocket and my phone's flashlight on, because the night was pitch black and we were well off the road, surrounded by nothing but forest and the sounds of the night. I walked up to the truck, stopped at the driver's window and knocked twice, saying, "Hello. Can we talk? Please roll down your window." But there was no response. I tried to peer inside, pressing my face against the glass and cupping my hands around my eyes to see better. What I saw, or rather, what I didn't see, made my blood run cold. There was absolutely nobody inside. I looked into the back of the cab and saw only a pile of old newspapers and empty fast food bags. It was obvious the truck had been abandoned for quite some time. I opened the door to confirm, and sure enough, it was completely empty. I can't describe the terror I felt in that moment. All I could think about was who, or what, had been driving it and following me all this time. I ran back toward my truck, but before I could climb in, I saw a figure standing several yards in front of my rig. I could make out their silhouette against the dim glow of my truck's parking lights. I called out hello, but they didn't answer. They just raised their arm, gesturing for me to follow them. I hesitated, but I followed anyway, thinking they might need help or know something about what was happening. They moved quickly, and I barely kept them in sight. The place smelled awful, like decaying animals or something even worse. I continued following the figure, until suddenly they stopped and began staring at a specific spot on the ground. I hurried over, but when I arrived, the person had vanished. I swept my flashlight around, calling out to find where they'd gone, but they never reappeared. Then I looked down at the spot they had been focused on, and there were 3 bodies, lifeless and partially covered with leaves and dirt. They had been there so long I couldn't even tell if they were men or women. I was horrified and ran back to my truck as fast as I could. But when I got there, the silver-gray truck was gone, vanished as mysteriously as it had appeared. I tried starting my engine again, and miraculously, it fired up on the first try. I managed to navigate back up to the road and called the police to report what I'd found. I drove with tears streaming down my face, deeply shaken by what I had just witnessed. When I finally reached a truck stop in Virginia, 2 of my trucker buddies were there, and seeing the state I was in when I stepped out of my rig, rushed over to find out what had happened. I could barely explain the night's events coherently, but they stayed with me, offering support because I was in no condition to keep driving. Then I received a call on my cell phone. It was one of the detectives who had gone to the location I'd reported. He said he wanted to ask me some questions, and I told him where I was. About 40 minutes later, 2 detectives arrived. They asked how I had found the bodies and what I was doing in that area. I didn't know how to answer because I knew my story would be hard to believe, but I told them everything, risking being accused of lying or even being detained as a suspect. When I finished my story, one of the detectives showed me a photograph and asked if this was the truck I had seen. I looked at it, surprised, and confirmed that it was indeed the same vehicle. The detectives exchanged glances, and then the other one began to explain that the truck belonged to 3 young people whose bodies had been found in those woods. They were journalism students who had disappeared about 3 weeks ago. Their families had reported them missing and said the students had been traveling to Baltimore to investigate a series of unsolved disappearances for a school project. But they never reached their destination. There had been no information about them for weeks. That's why it was so important to know how I had found their bodies. The young people had been shot, and the detectives wanted to make sure I wasn't connected to any criminal organizations. I was stunned. I broke down crying and insisted that everything I'd told them was the truth. The detectives calmed me down and told me to contact them if I remembered anything else. After they left, I sat there, overwhelmed by the realization that those young people, those souls, had chosen me to find their bodies and bring them back to their families so they could finally have closure. It was the most haunting experience of my entire career as a truck driver. Thank you for listening to my story. I drove an 18-wheeler for nearly 15 years, crisscrossing the heartland of America. There's something about the open road that gets in your blood, especially those long hauls through the night when it's just you, your thoughts, and the endless ribbon of asphalt stretching toward the horizon. Most nights were peaceful, meditative even. But what I'm about to tell you happened on a forgotten stretch of Route 12 in northern Montana, back in the winter of '97. And it's the reason I don't drive after midnight anymore. It was the dead of winter, temperature hovering somewhere around 15 below zero. The kind of cold that turns your breath into glass and makes the diesel in your tank sluggish. I was hauling industrial equipment from Seattle to Minneapolis, already 36 hours into my route, with another day's drive ahead of me. The snow had been falling steadily for hours, not the heavy stuff that forces you to pull over, but enough to make you grip the wheel tighter. Around 3 in the morning, I was passing through a stretch of absolutely nothing, just dense forest on both sides of the road. No lights, no houses, not even the occasional passing headlight. The nearest town, Blackwater, was still about 40 miles ahead. That's when my high beams caught something impossible, a figure standing at the side of the road. In that weather at that hour, miles from anywhere, it made no sense. But there she was, an elderly woman with silver hair, wearing what looked like a dark wool coat that fell to her ankles. She had one arm extended, thumb out, the universal sign of a hitchhiker. I almost didn't stop. Every trucker knows picking up strangers is risky business these days. But something about the situation didn't compute. How long had she been standing there in the killing cold? Where had she come from? Where was her car? I couldn't just leave her to freeze. I downshifted, eased onto the shoulder, and watched in my mirror as she approached. She moved stiffly, but purposefully, clutching a small cloth-covered basket to her chest. When she climbed into the cab, a blast of frigid air followed her. But it was more than just the winter cold. It was like opening a freezer that had been sealed for decades. "Evening, ma'am," I said once she'd settled. "You're a long way from anywhere. Where you headed?" The look she gave me could have frozen boiling water. "Drive," she said, her voice like two stones grinding together. "Just drive." Well, that put me in my place quick. I'm not one to pry, and I figured anyone out in those conditions probably had their reasons. So I pulled back onto the empty highway and kept my mouth shut. The next hour passed in complete silence. Every now and then, I'd glance over. She sat perfectly still, staring straight ahead, both hands resting on that basket in her lap. Under the greenish glow of the dashboard lights, her skin looked almost translucent, mapped with deep lines around her eyes and mouth. Not once did she remove her gloves or unbutton her coat, despite the heater blasting. As we approached the outskirts of Blackwater, I cleared my throat. "Town coming up. This your stop?" She didn't even look my way. "Keep going." Her tone left no room for argument, though a part of me was getting uneasy. The rational part of my brain kept reminding me she was just an old woman, probably eccentric, maybe running from something or someone. But there was something in the air, a smell I couldn't quite place. Not body odor or perfume, but something older, like wet earth and something metallic. About 20 minutes past Blackwater, she suddenly straightened up. "Stop here." I peered through the windshield. Nothing but forest, deeper and darker than before. "Ma'am, there's nothing out here for miles. Let me take you to somewhere with here." The force in her voice made me jump. "Stop." Now I eased onto the shoulder, keeping the engine running. Before I could say another word, she was already opening the door, the basket clutched tight against her. "Be careful out there," I said, truly concerned despite her rudeness. "It's dangerous in these woods at night. Bears, wolves." She turned then, and in the dome light I saw her face clearly for the first time. Her eyes were completely black, not just the irises, but the entire visible part. And when she smiled, God help me, her teeth were filed to points. "There's nothing in these woods more dangerous than me," she said, and her voice had changed, layered with something guttural underneath. "Thank you for the ride, Mr. Harrison." I froze. I had never told her my name. She stepped down into the snow and walked toward the tree line, her movements suddenly fluid and quick, not like an elderly person at all. Just before she disappeared into the darkness, she turned and lifted her basket. The cloth covering it slipped just for a second, and I caught a glimpse of something wet and red inside. I didn't wait another second. I slammed the door, locked it, and punched the gas. The big rig fishtailed on the icy road before the tires caught, and I didn't slow down until I hit the next town, 70 miles later. That should have been the end of it. A strange, unsettling encounter, but nothing more. People are weird sometimes, right? But 3 days later, after I'd made my delivery in Minneapolis and was heading back west, things started happening to my truck. First came the smell, like rotting meat mixed with something chemical and sharp. I thought maybe a small animal had gotten caught in the engine compartment and died. I had the entire truck cleaned inside and out at a service station in Billings, but the smell remained, getting stronger each day. Then came the sounds, scratching noises from inside the walls of the cab. At first, I told myself it was just the vibration of the road, or maybe mice. But no exterminator could find anything, and the sounds kept getting louder, more deliberate, especially at night. A week after picking up that woman, my brake lines mysteriously failed while I was descending a steep mountain pass near Coeur d'Alene. By some miracle, I managed to guide the truck into an emergency runaway ramp. The mechanic who inspected it afterward said it looked like the lines had been cut, not worn through, but deliberately severed, though he couldn't explain how it could have happened while I was driving. The electrical system went next. Lights flickering on and off, radio changing stations by itself, playing nothing but static or distorted voices speaking what sounded like Latin. The CB radio would transmit by itself sometimes, sending outbursts of what other drivers described as a woman crying or someone choking. The final straw came when I woke up in my sleeper berth one night to find the entire ceiling crawling with black widows and brown recluses, hundreds of them, all descending on nearly invisible threads. I'd never seen anything like it. It was physically impossible. Those spiders don't swarm like that. I abandoned the truck right there at the truck stop and called my dispatcher from inside the diner, telling him I quit. My wife, Jessica, who'd grown up on the Blackfeet reservation and knew the old ways, took one look at me when I arrived home by bus and knew something was terribly wrong. When I told her what had happened, she didn't call me crazy. Instead, she called her grandmother. The old woman came to our house that same day. She walked around me 7 times, counterclockwise, murmuring in her native language. Then she stopped and looked me straight in the eye. "You picked up something that wasn't human," she said simply. "Something old that dwells in the spaces between towns, in the forgotten places. It marked you and your truck because you saw what you weren't supposed to see." She performed a cleansing ritual that involved burning sage, cedar, and something else she wouldn't name. She made me bathe in water mixed with salt and certain herbs. For 7 days, I wasn't allowed to go out after sunset or before sunrise. I never went back for my truck. The company reported it stolen after a month, but I didn't care. My brother-in-law found me work at his construction company, and for 3 years, I couldn't bring myself to drive anything bigger than a pickup. Eventually, the nightmare stopped. The constant feeling of being watched gradually faded. I started driving rigs again, but I made 2 solemn promises: never to drive through northern Montana and never, ever to pick up hitchhikers, no matter how harmless they might appear. Sometimes, late at night when I'm alone with my thoughts, I wonder about that basket and what was inside it. But mostly, I thank whatever powers might be that I was merely marked and not taken. Because I've done my research since then, and it turns out I'm not the first driver to encounter the woman in the long coat on that stretch of Route 12. I'm just one of the few who lived to tell about it. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.